Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. My name is Tom Broussard. Today's topic is another scientist. His name is Sir Charles S. Sherrington from England. Um, he was a Nobel Prize, and he did a lot of work over a long, long period of time to help us better understand how the brain works. It's hard to believe that by far, most of my scientists, the ones I've been writing about, were all born in the 1800s. And a lot of them, most of them lived a very, very long life. I mean, we're talking 80, 90 years old. Sherrington lived until he was 94. He was born, of course, he was in England, but he was born before the Civil War here, United States. Um, and he lived through World War One, World War Two. He actually worked during World War One. He worked during the war. Um, so it is amazing that people do what they do from our perspective such a long time ago. And they travel a lot too. Today, of course, you can take airplanes, but they traveled then as much as you and I travel now using airplanes and cars. But they were taking, cars in Europe and ships to get to the United States and to other places. But when you read, especially after you read all of these scientists, you realize just amazing what they have done, coming from some of them are so poor, literally eating potatoes, and that was it. So it's amazing how these people have done what they've done. It really is. And he is one of them. Um, it's also interesting that an awful lot of these different scientists, as I came to understand them based on my experience as a person with stroke and aphasia, and had the opportunity to search for all of the scientists that led me to who I am and how I recovered. These people also work together, sometimes working without ever having seen each other, because it is, as much as they travel, it is still difficult to see everybody in Europe and the United States. But because at least by then they were taking photographs and writing books that could be moved around the world, a lot of them got to know each other, and in some cases did get to see each other and basically share their work going forward. All kinds of different languages had to be employed, different countries, different wars, such that some of those countries were at war with, quote, us, while they were still, the scientists really didn't care much about the war part of things, but obviously couldn't really do what they otherwise would have done, with the war getting in the way. But again, these scientists to me are heroes. Not that we don't have heroes today. I would like to think that these days everybody's a hero, as long as we all understand that everybody has their job to do, whatever it might be, and doing the best they can, whether you're a trash collector or a doctor. Everybody has to have some amount of empathy of what it is that we all do and how it is that all of us do contribute one way or the other to how each one of us lives with our family, and then how we build into the countries we now have, that we would like to think we'll have less wars rather than more, although we still have trouble with just humans being humans. Anyway, Sherrington lived a long life, did lots of work, eventually got a Nobel Prize winner. And what his work did, and the topic is synapses and the integrative action of the nervous system. Basically, he was, among others of his, quote, friends, even if some of them were never friends in life, but a lot of them were beginning to understand how the brain works and how the cells within the brain communicate to each other to really figure this out. How does all of that stimulus gets into the brain, and then how does it come out? The integrative component of this, how does that all come out, to be able to read, write, speak, whatever we do, because nothing happens without what goes in, and then it integrates that, and then it comes back out. So he did a lot of work with that, and what eventually became the neuron doctrine, which we still have today. Basically, it's how the neurons communicate with other neurons using, as we now know, but he was just figuring it out again with his friends, because the cells communicate with other cells, neurons are the brain cells, they communicate with electrical impulses and chemical impulses, and then of course the integrative capacity. So it took them a long time to figure out, when you're sending one impulse, one message from one cell to another, that it goes through as fast as it can electrically. But at a certain point, it comes to the next one, and there's a gap in between. That's where the synapse comes from. And now they can't send it by electrical, so they convert this impulse into a chemical set of messages, a neurotransmitter, and they do this, and it floats and binds and then takes off again. So that is how it works. Now, having done this, there's 100 billion cells in our brain, and our brain operates at about 4 billion flows a second. So you can imagine how fast this is happening. And again, that is part of the issue of people with stroke and aphasia, is when you have a stroke and you've lost a bunch of cells because of the stroke, clearly the speed that we used to have, obviously quickly and then floating, chemical messages floating here and then taking off again, a lot of that now is damaged, and it takes a lot longer to, quote, regrow the neural network that you had built before to grow new, not cells, but those cells have that capacity to grow new dendrites and synapses. And this is the synapse, and this is really where all learning happens. It has to go that way. So that's what they figured out over time. Each one had their own work that contributed to what we now know as the neuron doctrine that allows us to understand how the cells work. But he himself, Sherrington, actually did coin the word. I mean, he is the one who figured it out, that clearly there has to be a way to transmit from one cell to another, and he's studying this component of it, and that gap there is called the synapse, between the sending, receiving, and the gap in between. And he ended up calling that, and it's so interesting because in Greek it is called to clasp. And I do like the way he described it. I have a quote here in the article when he actually writes it down. And he says, okay, this is what I'm thinking is, and I'm going to use this word. And as he says, the term introduced has been synapse. In 1897. Can you imagine? Excuse me. So that is how we now have at least a big component of the neuron doctrine going forward. And you'll get to see some of these other scientists who knew each other, or they taught each other. I think the next article, this guy, Sherrington, actually one of his students is a guy named Wilder Penfield. That was one of his more famous students, and that'll be the next article. So you get to see how all of that came together when it comes to how they transmit messages. This is how scientists were transmitting messages, and thank goodness they have written it all down, so we get to see it now and understand how it happened. But it isn't like one of them figured it all out, come together. They figured out very individual little components of it, that then you put all that together, and now we have more technology than we didn't have before. And now we can understand, but at that point they were coming up with pieces of it coming together. And you'll get to see one of his students, Penfield, what he did, quote, next, based on, as they say, standing on the shoulders of others. Penfield learned a lot from Sherrington, and then took that and continued mapping how the brain works. So we'll talk about that at the next one. But believe it or not, Sherrington retired still late, but still had many, many, many more years to go. And he had done so much work for 50 years with the society, this scientific society in London. And he wrote this famous book based on his Nobel Prize and in 1906. And the scientists, the society there, realized that after 50 years that his book had gone out of print, this very, very famous book. So for a big conference, what they called a conference, a congress, they published that his old book, put a bunch of new information in it, and published it for him in 1947. And you would think, well, gosh, he started in 1950, 57. You mean 1947? He's still so much older, and yet he is still doing all this work. So yes, they did print this beautiful new set, gold limbed print and everything else. Well, I just want to tell you, I have a copy. I have a copy of one of these, of the original, done just for him at this particular conference. And I have to bind it. It's quite tattered, as I say, but it's amazing that this is the real McCoy. Picture of him in here, autographed, not by him personally, but autographed. But that is the integrative action of the nervous system, what it's all about. So he's quite the guy, and I do appreciate it. And believe it or not, he didn't die until March of 1952, 94 years. I was alive. I was born in January of 52. So as far away as that is in history, before the Civil War, I was alive when he was alive in 1952. Of course, I was only 3 months old. But here I am now going forward, having had my stroke, which allowed me to begin to study how all this really does work. And look how long ago it has been. Coming up soon enough, a couple more decades, I'll be gone, I'm sure, but coming up on 200 years just between the two of us going forward. So I really do love all of my scientific heroes, and Sherrington is definitely one of them. And he writes in such a wonderful, wonderful way. I want to read this to you, to quote it, because he is trying to help us better understand. Not on what I'm trying to do is using metaphors so people can better understand how the brain works. But he says here, it is as if the Milky Way enters upon some cosmic dance. Swiftly, the head mass becomes an enchanted loom where millions of flashing shuttles weave a dissolving pattern, always a meaningful pattern, though never an abiding one. A shifting harmony of sub patterns, which is really how it happens when you look at the brain. You can see these flashes, of course, as it's doing its thing, and you do realize that it is setting up this pattern that is wonderful and it's meaningful, but it disappears and create a new pattern using the same cells, using those components of it that allow it to be what it wants to be in a second, what it wasn't a second before. So he's quite a guy. If you ever get a chance to read some of his work, read his Nobel Prize. Most of these papers are relatively short, so you can print them out and be able to read them all and get a really good idea of what the tools they use, and how they use them at a time when they don't have anything that we now have today. So he was quite a hero. So that is it for this article. As I told you before, I'm working on 2022 scientists going forward for the rest of the year. So at least twice a month now, I'll be just showing you how all these scientists were working, as I say, together. And I think the next one is Penfield. So he is one of the students of Sherrington, and Penfield is from the United States, did a lot of traveling to Europe, and ended up going to Canada and becomes a Canadian citizen there as well. Nice to see everybody. Take care of yourself. Spring is coming. At least here in Maine, we are hoping that spring is coming. Take care of yourself. See you soon. Bye-bye.